Two owners' manuals are sitting on the desk in front of me, and they're for the exact same Toyota engine, except one was printed for the American market, and the other one was printed for Germany. And the oil specification on page 487 is not the same number, not even close. One says 0W20. The other one tells the owner of that identical engine in that identical car to run a heavier grade with a completely different high temperature rating. Same engine, same turbocharger, same factory in Japan. Two different answers. And once you understand why that gap exists, you'll also understand why so many Toyota turbos are starting to show a strange failure pattern somewhere between 135 and 150,000 miles, a pattern that's not supposed to exist on a Toyota. Now let me be specific about what we're talking about here. Toyota turbos don't die the way old Toyota engines used to die. They don't grenade at 80,000, they don't throw a rod at 110, they do something strange. They tend to show up somewhere between 135 and 150,000 miles. What you get is a slow, quiet loss of compression. You get timing chain stretch codes that come and go. You get turboshaft play that wasn't there at 90,000 miles. You get oil consumption that starts climbing from nothing to a quart every 2,000 miles, and then a quart every 1,000, and then faster. I'm talking about engines like the T24A FTS in the Highlander and Crown and Lexus NX, the V35A FTS in the Tundra, Sequoia, LX600, and the older 8AR FTS that showed up in the Lexus NX200T and some RAV4 turbo variants. These are direct injected boosted engines, and they don't behave like the legendary 2UZ or 1GR that made Toyota's reputation. They're a different animal, and the maintenance approach most owners are using was, in a lot of ways, designed for the old animal. Before anyone accuses me of turning on Toyota, let me be specific about where this information is coming from, because none of it is my opinion. Blackstone Laboratories publishes used oil analysis trend data by engine family, and the direct-injected Toyota turbos show a pattern of fuel dilution and viscosity shear that's measurably worse than the naturally aspirated counterparts. SAE, the Society of Automotive Engineers, has published multiple peer-reviewed papers on low-speed pre-ignition in boosted direct-injected engines running low-viscosity oils. Toyota's own technical service bulletins address oil consumption and chain elongation on these platforms. And then there's the European service documentation, which for the same engines specifies a different oil grade than the American owner's manual. That's not a rumor, that's a printed document. So what I'm going to walk you through now isn't a hot take, it's the boring, documented version of a story that should have gotten a lot more attention than it has. Here's the part almost nobody explains on YouTube, and it's the single most important number in this entire conversation. It's called HTHS, high temperature, high shear viscosity. It's measured at 150 degrees Celsius under a standardized shear rate, and it's the number that tells you how much oil film is actually left between your moving parts when the engine is hot and working hard. Think of it this way. Regular kinematic viscosity, the 20 or 30 in the grade name, is like measuring honey at room temperature. HTHS is measuring that same honey at the temperature of a pizza oven while it's being whipped through a tiny gap at 10,000 RPM. It's a completely different number, and it's the one that actually matters for turbo bearings, cam lobes, and piston rings. A standard 0W20 sits right at the industry minimum for HTHS. We're talking 2.6 centipoise. That's the floor. That's the number regulators said you're not allowed to go below, and most 0W20s are engineered to sit exactly at or just above that floor because going lower would fail spec, and going higher would lose a sliver of fuel economy. The European specification for that same engine, the one in that German manual I've got on the desk, it calls for an oil with HTHS in the 3.2 to 3.5 centipoise range. So we're talking roughly 25 to 35% more hydrodynamic film strength under the exact conditions a turbocharged engine spends most of its life in. That's not a marketing difference. That's a physical difference in how much metal-to-metal protection you have at the turbo bearing journal at 240 degrees Fahrenheit. And on an engine with a turbo spinning at 150,000 RPM supported by a film of oil, that 25% is not cosmetic. Let me put that in physical terms, because numbers on a spec sheet are abstract until you picture what they actually mean. A turbo bearing is essentially a spinning metal shaft riding inside a stationary metal sleeve. The shaft isn't actually touching the sleeve, it's hovering on a pressurized film of oil that's roughly the thickness of a human hair, sometimes thinner. That film is what protects the bearing. When the HTHS number drops, the film gets thinner. When the film gets thin enough, the shaft starts kissing the sleeve at the load points. Not a collision, just a slight, repeated microscopic contact that happens thousands of times a minute. You can't hear it. The engine doesn't throw a code. But every single one of those microcontacts peels off a little bit of metal, and that metal ends up circulating through your oil until the next drain interval catches it. Do that for 60,000 miles, and you have a turbo with measurable shaft play. Do it for another 40,000, and you have a turbo that starts eating its own thrust washer. That's the mechanism. That's what the 140,000 mile failure actually looks like at the bearing level. Now here's where it compounds, because these engines don't just run on thin oil. They actively thin it out further while you drive. Direct injection, by its nature, sprays fuel directly into the combustion chamber at very high pressure. Some of that fuel, under cold starts, short trips, and long idle conditions, works its way past the piston rings and into the oil. It's called fuel dilution, and it's not a defect. It happens on every direct injected engine ever built, but the amount varies dramatically. Blackstone's aggregate data shows Toyota turbo platforms routinely logging 3 to 6% fuel in oil by volume on normal duty samples. 6% fuel in a 0W20 doesn't behave like 0W20 anymore. It behaves like a 0W16 or thinner, which means that HTHS number I just talked about, the one that started at the floor, it drops through the floor somewhere around month 4 of a 6-month drain interval. And now your turbo bearing is being asked to float on an oil film that's 30% weaker than the spec the engineers originally tested against. You can see why varnish starts forming. You can see why the ring packs start gumming up. This isn't mystical. It's chemistry and tribology playing out on a schedule. And there's a second failure mode hiding inside this same oil specification, and it has a name the industry spent almost a decade trying to engineer out of modern motor oil. It's called low-speed pre-ignition, LSPI. And what happens is this: at low RPM, under high load, the exact conditions you hit merging onto a highway, from a stop, or pulling a boat up a grade, or passing someone uphill, a droplet of oil or fuel-diluted oil can ignite in the combustion chamber before the spark plug fires. That pre-ignition event creates a pressure spike that can break a piston ring land, crack a piston, or fracture a rod bearing. This isn't theoretical, it's why the API introduced the SP category, and ILSAC introduced GF6, both specifically designed to include LSPI-resistant additive packages. But here's the catch. Thinner oils are statistically more prone to the underlying conditions that create LSPI events. The additive chemistry helps, but it doesn't eliminate the physics. A 0W20 with LSPI-resistant additives is safer than a 0W20 without them. But a 5W30 meeting, the same spec, has more margin on both counts. More film, more protection, fewer droplets at the wrong place at the wrong time. This is the part I want you to slow down for, because this is where the paper trail gets uncomfortable. Toyota has issued technical service bulletins on these turbo platforms addressing oil consumption, chain elongation, and, in a few cases, engine replacement criteria. The V35A FTS in the Tundra went through a high-profile engine recall in 2024 involving manufacturing debris, which isn't the same issue as what we're discussing, but what it revealed was how thin the margins are on these engines when something goes slightly wrong. Meanwhile, in the European service documentation for the Toyota engines sold there, the recommended oil is not 0W20. Depending on the exact market and model year, it's 0W30 or 5W30. Meeting specs like ACEA C2, C3, or specific Toyota fluid standards that require higher HTHS than the American ILSAC grade. Same engine block, same turbo, different oil in the sump. And Toyota's technical bulletins in those markets don't contradict that, they reinforce it. So when an American owner reads their manual, follows the 0W20 recommendation, and runs dealer-recommended 10,000-mile drain intervals, they are not doing anything wrong according to the document in their glove box. They're also, it turns out, not running the same protection protocol Toyota specifies for the identical engine on the other side of the Atlantic. And this isn't just a European quirk. If you pull the Australian service documentation for the Hilux variants that share engine architecture, you'll see the same pattern. Heavier oil recommendations, shorter intervals in severe duty conditions, and explicit language about turbocharged applications requiring different maintenance than the NE equivalents. The Japanese domestic market documentation for some of these engines goes a similar direction. The outlier, consistently, is the United States. And there's a reason for that. And it's not a conspiracy, it's regulatory. The EPA's fuel economy testing methodology and the way CAFE credits are calculated create a strong incentive for manufacturers to specify the thinnest oil that can legally meet durability requirements during the warranty period. Warranty period, not engine lifetime. Those are two different targets, and if you own the vehicle past 100,000 miles, you're outside the window the engineering was primarily optimized for. I want to be careful here, because I'm not accusing Toyota of doing anything illegal or even unusual for the industry. Ford does the same thing, GM does it, Honda does it. The entire industry has been pushed toward thinner oils by the same regulatory pressure, and the engineering trade-offs are real. But when you're the person who's going to own a turbocharged vehicle past the warranty cliff, the calculus is different for you than it is for the fleet average owner who's going to trade the vehicle in at 70,000 miles. And the documentation supporting a different maintenance approach for long-term owners isn't hidden. It's just printed in a different language, in a different country, for the same engine. Now, in fairness to Toyota, their reasoning for 0W20 isn't stupid, and I want to lay it out honestly before I go any further. First, fuel economy. The US CAFE standards are aggressive, and every tenth of a mile per gallon matters to a manufacturer at that scale. Thinner oil reduces pumping losses and internal friction, which measurably improves fuel economy, usually in the 1% to 2% range. Over a full fleet, that's the difference between meeting CAFE and getting fined. Second, cold start protection. A 0W20 flows faster than a 5W30 at 20 below zero, and the first 30 seconds after, a cold start are when the most engine wear actually happens. So there's a real, legitimate protection argument on the cold side. And third, on a naturally aspirated engine, the 2.5 liter in a Camry, the 3.5 liter in a non-turbo Highlander, ZW20 works perfectly fine. Those engines don't have a turbo bearing demanding a thick hydrodynamic film at 240 degrees Fahrenheit. For them, the spec is honest. It's not wrong, it just doesn't transplant cleanly onto the turbo variants, and that's the part that got glossed over. If you pulled the valve cover off one of these engines, at 145,000 miles, here is what you would actually be looking at. On the camshafts, you'd likely see a light brown varnish on the lobes and bearing surfaces. Not catastrophic, but noticeably thicker than what you'd see on an old 2AZ at the same mileage. On the timing chain, you'd measure some elongation, often enough to set a P1008 or P1016 code intermittently. At the turbocharger, if you grabbed the compressor wheel and tried to wobble it in and out, you'd feel axial play that wasn't there at 90,000 miles. The thrust bearing has been eating itself on a weak oil film. Pull a piston, and the ring package tells the story. The top ring groove may show carbon pack, the oil control ring may be partially seized in its groove, and that's the mechanism behind the climbing oil consumption. None of this is dramatic. Nothing blew up, the engine still runs. But it's a vehicle that, at 145,000 miles, is showing the wear profile of an engine with 220,000 miles on it. That's the gap. That's the cost. So here's the part where I stop diagnosing and start giving you something you can actually do this week. And I'm going to break it out by situation because not every Toyota Turbo owner is in the same risk bucket. If you own one of these trucks or SUVs, you're under factory warranty, and you live somewhere the summer temperatures regularly climb into the 90s or higher, stay on 0W20 to preserve your warranty, but cut the drain interval roughly in half, forget the 10,000 mile schedule, run 4,000 to 5,000 miles full synthetic, a quality oil meeting API SP and ILSAC GF6A, and keep every receipt. You're not fighting the manual, you're respecting it while compensating for the real world conditions it doesn't fully account for. If you're over 80,000 miles out of warranty, driving a 2.4 turbo or a V35A FTS, and you've been wondering whether to move off spec, this is where the conversation gets more interesting. A growing number of independent Toyota specialists are running 0W30 or 5W30 full synthetic on these engines out of warranty, looking for an HTHS number of at least 3.0 centipoise, API SP and LSPI rated with a robust additive package. The logic is straightforward. You've lost the warranty argument anyway, and you're now optimizing purely for longevity. That extra film strength is the cheapest longevity insurance available. Talk to your mechanic. Look at what the European spec calls for on your specific engine. Make an informed decision. And here's something to keep in mind when you're reading the bottle at the parts counter. Not every 5W30 on the shelf is the same. A bargain brand 5W30 that barely meets the ILSAC spec is not what you're looking for. What you want is a full synthetic API SP ILSAC GF6A, ideally with a manufacturer approval, like a MB 229.521 or a VW504 Pro or a BMW long life spec printed on the back label. Those European manufacturer approvals require HTHS numbers well above the ILSAC minimum, and an oil that carries those approvals tends to use a better additive package with more stable base stocks. It's not about brand loyalty. It's about reading the spec block on the back of the bottle and knowing what the numbers mean. A good quality conventional 5W30 will cost you maybe $6 more per oil change than the cheapest option on the shelf. That is a rounding error compared to what a replacement turbocharger costs. If you're driving a naturally aspirated Toyota, a Camry 2.5, a non-turbo Highlander, a RAV04 hybrid, keep doing what you're doing. ZW20 on that spec sheet is honest. The turbo-specific concerns I've been describing do not apply to you, and switching to a heavier oil on an NA engine designed for 0W to 20 will cost you fuel economy without buying meaningful protection. Not every Toyota owner needs to panic. This is specifically a turbocharged, direct injected problem. And here's the dipstick check I want you to do this weekend, regardless of which bucket you're in. Pull the dipstick when the engine is warm, but shut off for about 10 minutes. First, look at the level. Is it at the high mark or above? If it's above, that's a flag for fuel dilution. Second, smell it. It should smell like hot oil, maybe slightly burnt. If you catch a gasoline note in there, that's fuel dilution you can detect with your nose. Third, look at the color and consistency. Healthy oil at 4,000 miles should still be amber to medium brown. If it's jet black and thin feeling by mile 4,000, your drain interval is too long for the conditions you're driving in. 3 minutes, no tools, and you know more about the health of your engine than 95% of owners who've never done it. If this shifted how you think about your own truck or SUV, I want to hear about it, because the comment section on these oil spec videos is honestly more useful than half the TSPs Toyota publishes. Tell me what engine you're running, what mileage you're at, what oil you're using, and whether you've seen any of the warning signs I just described. The pattern in those comments is real data, and other owners are reading it. And if you know somebody driving a Tundra, a Sequoia, a Highlander Turbo, or a Lexus with one of these engines, send this over before they hit that 140,000 mile wall, not after. Subscribe if you want the next breakdown in this series, and where I'm going to cover exactly what your options are if you're already seeing oil consumption climb, and you want to know whether you can slow it down, reverse it, or whether the damage is already locked in. That's the next conversation. I'll see you there.